this on Facebook to remind folks, so I'm glad that y'all are here anyway. Now, a couple months ago, we ended our chronological study of Suwannee County's history. So now we have been, since last month, getting into topical studies. So today we're going to look at railroads in Suwannee County, and to go into some detail, a little bit more detail perhaps than I did Saturday at the All Aboard Festival that we had at the museum, because I only had about 45, 50 minutes to talk on that one. So we may go a little over today, we'll see. I tried to shorten it a hair, but we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about other transportation towards the end of the series, because we've already got the ones in between it set out. Next time I do this go around, I will probably put transportation right behind or right before railroads. So, glad that y'all are here. Railroads. The Pensacola and Georgia Railroad was the first of many railroads that came through Suwannee County, or what would become Suwannee County. And railroads in general have had a great importance to our history. Pretty much every one of the communities that we have even today, those that are left, places like Live Oak, Welborn, Dowling Park, Branford, McAlpin, O'Brien, those pretty much are because of the railroad. Their locations and their ability to sustain themselves were because of railroads such as here the Pensacola and Georgia Railroad. The first railroad through Suwannee County. It was chartered in January of 1853, and it was completed up to basically Lake City, at which point there was another railroad, the Florida and at the time it was Gulf, or Atlantic and Gulf, carried on from Lake City to Jacksonville. So they made one unending railroad from past Tallahassee over to Jacksonville. It's called the Pensacola and Georgia. And as we go through this lesson today, you're going to figure out very quickly that although they may have names like Pensacola and Georgia, it does not mean they're going to get to either one of those locations. So in this railroad's case, it didn't really get to Georgia. Eventually, in a way it did, but it didn't get to Pensacola. So you will see that throughout the rest of this presentation. Grandiose schemes, eyes bigger than their wallets, those kinds of things. So, this railroad, the president of the railroad was a man by the name of Edward Houston. Edward Houston. Not Houston, but Houston. And so that is most likely the reason we have a Houston Street in Live Oak and our first county seat, permanent county seat, of Houston, which was the county seat for 10 years before Live Oak. They are named for this gentleman. And I tell people this all the time. I know if you're not from here, when you call it Houston Street or the community of Houston, that's a dead giveaway that you are not from here. Because everybody else in town that's been here knows it's Houston. And the other joke is it's because of Sam Houston that people think that way in the city of Houston. But if you look at it, do you live in a house or do you live in a Hughes? I live in a house. So, Houston makes more sense to me, but I'm a Live Oak boy, so I guess that's why. Anyway, this Pensacola and Georgia Railroad was completed 1 month before the Civil War began. So it didn't really get to see a lot of transportation, passenger services before the war started, and things got a little different. When it crossed the Suwannee River over at Columbus, which is now the Suwannee River State Park, they built a wooden covered railroad bridge. This is a picture of either that bridge or the exact replacement that we'll talk about in a little bit, just a minute or two, of that bridge there at Columbus, what's now the state park. You see here, this is part of the old ferry crossing, which you can still see today if you go out to the state park. I believe you walk right over it. It's a slope into the ground down to the river. So that gives you an idea of where the ferry crossing was versus the railroad. It's pretty much where the railroad tracks are today, more or less, even today. They was shifted a little bit as they built bridges and such, but pretty much more or less about the same location. So, a point with this is wooden, covered. Covered's great, nice, that's pretty. It's a wooden bridge. railroad engines of the time, here in Florida anyway, used wood. They were wood burning, and so they would spit out hot embers as they traveled. And so every time a train crossed this bridge, they basically, the company had hired a couple of boys, somebody that could run out there from either end of either side of the Suwannee River, and they would run into that bridge and then douse all the embers out with water so it didn't burn down. Sensible thing, I believe. It's always funny to me that this was a covered wooden railroad bridge, but it worked for many years. Post-Civil War, during the Civil War, it was kind of one of the Union's main goals during the Battle of Olustee, which we'll talk about in more detail a little bit. But it survived the war. In 1876, George Drew, who lived just across the Suwannee River into Madison County, became governor of Florida. He was the first post-Reconstruction governor of Florida. And as one of the stories goes, basically this was a time of a lot of upheaval in the South between Reconstruction and all that kind of stuff. And he was a Democrat, and the Republicans who had been in charge did not really want him to become governor. And so forces over in Jacksonville that were loyal to the Republicans sent troops over to arrest Governor Drew. And they're called Democrats and Republicans, but there's a lot of change, so it's not the same ones as today. But these Republican troops start traveling by train over to Suwannee County and then over into Madison County to arrest Governor Drew. Well, Governor Drew has lots of friends on the railroad because he's been using them for his business. And so they let him know. He gets wind of these troops coming to arrest him. So according to the story, what he did was he went in and had his folks measure this entire bridge, get out all the iron, all the stuff on the trains travel over the tracks, pull them out and store them in a warehouse that he had, and then he burned the bridge down. So the troops had to stop at the Suwannee River, could not cross, and to arrest him. So he was able to get to Tallahassee, and he was sworn in. Supposedly there was an assassination attempt on his life, even there in Tallahassee. But he became first post-Reconstruction governor of Florida. Went into office 1877, beginning of it. One of his first orders was to rebuild the bridge. So this is either that one or the original. It's hard to tell because they were exact. According to the stories, during that Battle of Olustee, I should have mentioned also, because of the threat of the Union forces attacking it and taking it over or burning it, there was a last-ditch defense set up on either side of about 15 men each. Push come to shove, they'll burn the bridge if nothing else will happen. And so some of those earthen works that were there from that time and later during the war are still there at the state park, so you can see them today. Anyway, so that's that wooden covered railroad bridge. Kind of funny. Always found that funny. So the P&G, Pensacola and Georgia, operated throughout the Civil War, but it didn't really connect with other railroads either in Florida or up into Georgia and the rest of the Confederacy. So they began construction of what was called at the time the Live Oak and Lawton Connector. And they were trying to decide where to put that, and they eventually decided on a very new train station stop called Live Oak Station. Small community had just started. And so by 1861, this is May of 1861, the first time I have found where Live Oak is mentioned, they have decided by this point, this is where we're going to put it. We're going to put that connection because that was closer to the Georgia railroads than any place else. And it's still like 47 miles away. They looked at other locations, which you can read in there, maybe further closer to Tallahassee or closer to Jacksonville, but they said Live Oak's a good spot. And so they start construction of this. Lawton is now the town of DuPont, Georgia. And a lot of times when you go through the records, this connector line is called the Florida branch of the Pensacola and Georgia. And they continued to work on this throughout the war. There was lots of issues with finding the right goods, especially the iron. Iron was hard to come by. My wife says I say iron funny, but anyway, iron. It was hard to come by in the South. And so what they did was they took up, let's see if I can go back. They took up some of the rails from the Florida Railroad, which was built by Senator David Yulee originally. It went from Fernandina pretty much down to Cedar Key. Well, those termini, those endings, had both been captured by the North. And so it wasn't really any good for the Confederacy. So they started taking up the rails from the rest of it and put it on this, you can see a little bit of it right here, the Florida branch, this Live to Lawton connector, to be able to put it in service. And they did. It was finally open to the public, so to speak, in 1 month before the Civil War ended. So it really didn't help the South very much. However, it did help Live Oak after the Civil War grow, because if you were coming by train into Florida, you had to go through Live Oak. Live Oak was basically the first stop, and it was the one that would take you east and west, and eventually even south. So lots of people moved in to Live Oak specifically because of this branch, this connector line. So let's see. All right, and there we go. There's another picture of it showing the entire connector there. And you can see how it goes down to the Atlantic and Gulf Railroad, that one up there in Georgia. But you can see that connection. And that's what brought people to Live Oak. Live Oak grew from a little hamlet of, maybe 50 people, if that, in the area, to hundreds of people, and then by 30 years later, thousands of people were living just in Live Oak, the town of Live Oak, which had been incorporated by that point. So that railroad helped Live Oak grow, and technically become the county seat of Suwannee County, because Houston had been in. Houston was also on that railroad line, a few miles to the east. Well, Pensacola and Georgia sold its connector line, that Florida branch, in 1866 to the Atlantic and Gulf Railroad. Part of the issue was they needed to sell it to make some money, because David Yulee had sued. Even as the war was going on, the Civil War was going on, David Yulee sued the Pensacola and Georgia for taking his iron. So it went through Confederate courts, and then when the war ended, it went through other courts, and they basically said P&G's got to give all of it back. So they had to strip all that iron off of that Florida branch, give it back to Yulee, who hoped to rebuild the Florida Railroad, but it never really happened. And so the P&G had to wait for more iron to come back in. It didn't take too long, because it was post-war. They had the manufacturing capabilities in the North again. So it didn't take too long to put it back in service, which again allowed lots of folks to come here. A couple years later, they are still having financial difficulties, the P&G, Pensacola and Georgia. And so they sell their interest basically in that railroad to a guy by the name of George Sampson. And he was a scallywag, which meant he was somebody from the South that kind of supported the North during the Civil War. So he bought it out in conjunction with some other folks, including a carpetbagger named Milton Littlefield, who was a former Union general, and his nickname was, quote, Prince of the Carpetbagger, because he had multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, lies, and cheating that he was charged and found guilty of. Not so good of a guy. But he helped basically buy up Pensacola and Georgia, and they merged it with what had been the Florida Atlantic and Gulf Railroad, and that was the latest name of that one, going from Lake City to Jacksonville, and they merged them together to make the Jacksonville, Pensacola, and Mobile Railroad. And so they do that. Which gets me into another discussion. As we go through this, you're going to see lots of name changes of this, especially two of the railroads we're going to be talking about. The Pensacola and Georgia Railroad, which is technically the same basic railroad that is still here in Live Oak today. That one is going to go through about 10 different name changes as we go through the next few minutes. And then the north-south running one, which the Florida branch was part of that, is going to have a bunch of different names also. So you're going to see that as we go through this presentation. You're also going to see a lot of similarly named railroads that sound very close. I have to keep looking at my notes to make sure I get it right, because there are so many railroads. So many. And so many with similar names. And so it's easy to get lost. At the end of the presentation, eventually, after doing this a few times, I decided, let me just show like a description of here's what it was and here's all the different names, boom, 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 on one page for each railroad, each of the main railroads. So that will help you see all the different names that they went by over the last 170 years in some cases. So that picture there is in Tallahassee. It's the JP&M Depot, which was originally built for Pensacola, Georgia in 1858. So that predates the Civil War, but that was the depot in Tallahassee at the time. So for a few years, it continues on as the Jacksonville, Pensacola, and Mobile Railroad, the JP&M Railroad. We've got lots of records of it at the courthouse. As they buy and sell property, they give away land, those kinds of things. Well, in 1882, an Englishman by the name of Sir Edward Reed purchased it, the JP&M, and he renamed it the Florida Central and Western Railroad, the FCNW. And then a couple years later, he consolidates that railroad with a few others and to create the Florida Railway and Navigation Company, which he then renames in 1888 to the Florida Central and Peninsular Railroad. So it goes from the FCNW to the FRNC to the FCPR in just a number of 6 years. So again, lots of different names. In 1888, there is a yellow fever epidemic in Jacksonville. Yellow fever, very highly contagious. Lots of people stricken. Just in Jacksonville, you've got thousands of people that are hit with it, and you've got hundreds of people that are dying just in Jacksonville. And you know, after what we suffered 4 years ago, starting 4 years ago, we can see a little bit of the struggles that the citizens were going through when we had COVID going through. So what they did to stop that spread of that yellow fever is they basically stopped all trains coming out of Jacksonville. You're not gonna come in unless we check and make sure everybody's basically got a I'm not sick card. That also sounds familiar. You got to get out of jail free kind of thing. That no one or nothing is sick, and there better be nothing coming from Jacksonville. We don't want anything from Jacksonville coming or anybody. And so the county commission records that I have access to at the courthouse, one of my jobs is clerk to the board, you read through that, and even the city council records that I've got copies of. You go through, and they're posting guards along Suwannee County's border. All the roads, all the railroads, they've got guards stopping everybody to make sure nobody from Jacksonville is coming through, nothing from Jacksonville is coming through, and nobody is sick. Let's see, places like Columbus, Live Oak, Branford, stopping all the railroads there, plus the roads. Eventually it got bad enough that they weren't allowing any trains from the east to come into Live Oak or Suwannee County. It's like, nope, you stop, you go back, we are not taking you, which is pretty bad. Pretty bad. And it gets to the point where even in Live Oak, for instance, they shut down all public assemblies. That includes political things, that includes church meetings. Again, after 2020, we can kind of understand a little bit of what was going through their heads and what they were facing. It even got to the point that you've got a lot of politicians that are vacating their post, leaving their post, resigning. Now, a lot of them, it seems, because they're doctors, and their goods or their services are needed elsewhere. They set up a sick camp, all that kind of stuff. So it's pretty bad. But after a year or so, it dies down. Life resumes back to normal. Trains are allowed back in. These politicians go back to their duties, those kinds of things. So it's very interesting.
What year is that again?
1888. The whole interesting thing about how they tried to ward off yellow fever by shooting guns in the air would help, they thought, so that you go to Jacksonville, everybody's shooting off guns. Smoking off some stuff was one of the things, and there was a guy that was really pushing it, saying this is the cure-all, until he died of typhoid, of yellow fever. They figured out maybe it wasn't. So just all kinds of craziness going on, just to try to, hey, again, we understand, don't we? 2020. COVID. It was bad. Yeah, that was 1888. So that's under, at that time, the Florida Central and Peninsula Railroad. And that's how it stays for about 15 years. Then the Seaboard Airline buys up the majority of the stock in 1899 and leases what's left in 1900. And then in 1903, they purchase everything. So by 1903, the Florida Central and Peninsular, which was the successor to that one, is now in charge. The SAL, Seaboard Airline. And that goes along for a good 60-something years until 1967, they merged, the SAL, Seaboard Airline merges with the Atlantic Coastline, which is their major competitor, and they're the ones that have the north-south running that we're about to talk about in a few minutes. And they merged together to create the Seaboard Coastline Railroad, which in 1982 becomes part of the Seaboard system, and then in 1986 becomes CSX Transportation, and then that's what it was until 2019 when it becomes part of the Florida Gulf and Atlantic Railroad, which is very close to part of what the railroad used to be called way back when. So you get all these similar names over the years. But that's just one of the railroads and railroad lines that we have going through Suwannee County. So before I get into the next section, I've got to talk about this guy here, Henry Bradley Plant. You can't talk about Florida and railroads without talking about the two Henrys, Henry Flagler and Henry Plant. Henry Plant gets the central and western side of Florida pretty much. Henry Flagler gets the east coast of Florida pretty much. These two Henrys bring in millions of people over the, a few decades. Plant was born in a place called Branford, Connecticut in 1819. His father died when he was 6. He became a cabin boy on a steamship, but then he worked his way up until he was finally learning the package express business, and he got very heavily involved in that. By 1850s, he is running the New York office of the Adams Express Company, but his wife gets sick. And so like a lot of sick people in that era, what they were told to do was go down south, places like Florida, to get away from the sick weather up north. And so that's what he does. He comes down into Georgia, starts living in Augusta, Georgia. He develops his transportation contacts, continues to operate from that Adams Express Company, and expands it greatly. Well, when the war breaks out, the Civil War breaks out, Adams Express, which is headquartered in the north, realizes, they realize that they are going to lose all their southern investments, and so they decide to sell out to Henry Plant. He buys it up, and he goes to work. Now, he is not really in favor of the war. He is, he's kind of on the fence, but he really doesn't want to see a war, but he sees where he can make a profit. He's a businessman first, and so he works that out, including saying, hey, Confederacy, I will transfer your payroll and currency shipments as long as I can then, in return, freely ship goods and stuff back to the soldiers, like from home. So the Confederacy says that's good, that'll work, and the investment makes him very rich. Unfortunately, his wife dies in 1863 despite the change in climate, but he continues on. So by the end of the war, he is a very rich man. When the Civil War ends and things are starting to get back to normal, he realizes that railroads are going to be the way to go. That's what's going to bring industry into the South, to rebuild what was already lost, and then to expand what wasn't there in the first place. So he buys up all these bankrupt railroads that have lost money over the years, or because of the Civil War, and he keeps spreading out. He knows transportation is a big thing. So what he does is he buys up places like the bankrupt Charles and Savannah Railroad, and then he starts buying up other railroads in the area, and he creates what's called the Savannah, Florida, and Western Railway, the SF&W, in 1879. And so it starts buying up lots of railroads in the southeast. We'll hit more of it in just a minute. We'll come back to it. Because meanwhile, there's other people, more local people, that are busy trying to build railroads in Suwannee County. Because again, people are coming into Suwannee County through Live Oak mainly because of that one branch coming in. And so they want to access the timber, they want to access turpentine, eventually want to start accessing the phosphate that is found a few decades later. So you've got all these people that are wanting to get a piece of the pie in Suwannee County. And so one of them is the Live Oak and Rollins Bluff Railroad. It was chartered in 1881 to basically continue where the Florida branch stopped in Live Oak. They want to keep going south through Suwannee County. And They want to get to a place called Roland's Bluff, which is on the Suwannee River. And it gets renamed very shortly to a place you might have heard of called Branford. And it's named originally New Branford, and it's named after Henry Plant's hometown of Branford, Connecticut. Robert Ivy is mayor and bigwig down there, and so he's good friends with Henry Plant, and so he's the one that changes the name from Roland's Bluff to New Branford, which then becomes Branford. But in the meantime, folks are trying to get a railroad down to that community, and so the Live Oak and Roland's Bluff Railroad is established. And it is consolidated very quickly with some of Henry Plant's other holdings to become part of that SF&W in 1884. Now, this railroad is mainly built by convict labor. And I didn't bring the book to read from because it would take too much time. I know we can't stay 2 hours here. But the book American Siberia, which the library should have a copy. If not, it's online. You can find it online for free. It's about 400 pages, give or take a few. And the book is written by a guy by the name of J.C. Powell. He was captain of the convict labor system in Florida post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction. And basically what happened was, at the end of Reconstruction, when the Democrats took office again, they realized that the state's coffers was bankrupt. And so they were trying to find a way to make money. So they decided, let's lease out our state convicts, our state prisoners, to the highest bidder. That highest bidder will basically, or is supposed to, take care of them, feed for them, provide for them, give them medical care, and basically put them to work. And so they'll get cheaper labor than if they hired somebody off the street. The state doesn't have to house and feed these folks. So it was kind of a win-win situation for them anyway. Everybody but the prisoners. And so these prisoners were put to work doing things like turpentine, railroad building, road clearing, all that kind of stuff. And so the book American Siberia, 90% of the book takes place in Suwannee County because post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, half at least of the state's convicts are working in Suwannee County. That's how important we are to the state as a whole. And they are helping, among other things, to build this very railroad. So there's a section that Mr. Powell writes about this railroad being built, and he talks about people down in what's now the Branford area. And he talks about them being a superstitious lot. They were backwoodsmen. They grew up out in the woods. They didn't know anything about modern conveniences at the time. One of the comments he says basically is if you had told them that the earth revolves around the sun, they'd probably burn you as a heretic. So, you know, their ideas are a little off still scientifically. And that's the kind of people that are out in the woods. Well, some of these folks get wind of a railroad being built, and they're kind of curious to see what this whole railroad thing is, the railroad engine is. And so there's this mountain man looking guy that comes out with his wife and his kids. And I mean, you know, he's grizzled, and you'd think he could kill a bear because he probably has. But they sit there waiting for a train to come by as Mr. Powell's talking to them. And he tells them, hey, there's one coming, just hold up. And so they're sitting there, they're standing there watching. And then they hear the engine, you know, the whistle, and that freaks them out. They start like, what's going on? And then they see smoke billowing, and so they're getting even more scared. And then they see the engine. First they see the box cars and stuff, the flat cars being pushed. And so they see the stuff moving on wheels, and they're freaking out. It's like, how are these things moving by themselves? And then the engine comes around the bend, and they basically freak out and run away. It scares them so much. They don't come back. They've seen enough of technology for one time. One of the other stories that he mentions in this book about this railroad is just after it was completed, there was an old settler, and I don't remember if he actually said the name of him, but this guy had been known around these parts for decades. He was another burly guy. He had killed bears since he was a kid. He was almost scared of nothing except trains. And so he was ordered to report to Jacksonville for federal jury duty. And he had to go by train, and he basically had to be forced onto the railroad, onto the train, and he freaked out. Even when they were bumping together to connect another car, he freaked out, about jumped out. They had to kind of restrain him. So he eventually calmed down, and after that, he became a frequent rider of the train. He got over his fear. So there's stories like that in the book and a whole lot more. So if you haven't read American Siberia by J.C. or John C. Powell, read it. It's a good book. It's a good book. It's fun. You will see things about Suwannee County that you probably never heard before. And you'll see some names probably you've heard of, maybe. And see, if you listen to me, you've heard of them before. It's just very interesting. Very interesting. But that was the Live Oak and Rollins Bluff that he was talking about. There was a couple other stories I'll go throw them out. We got plenty of time. You don't have anywhere to go, do you, at 1 o'clock? Right? No? How about 2 o'clock? One of the other stories that he mentions is just south of Live Oak, there was a guy that had a business. He pretty much was a squatter at this point and had put his business, his log cabin business, right where the railroad was going to go through. And he threatened that he'd shoot anybody that tried to get him out. And so what the railroad company did under J.C. Powell's orders and supervision was they built the railroad line all the way up to the building and then went the other way. So they both come up to the building here in the middle, and he's refusing to leave. He's in there. He's got his guns. He said, y'all touch me, I'm going to shoot you. And so Mr. Powell gets his convicts, and they basically pick the whole thing up, the whole house up, and move it. He runs out. The guy runs out when the rafters start to fall in. But he runs out and says, all right, I surrender, I give up. So they just move it just to the other side of the railroad. They nail all the boards back on it, and they keep working. So that's another one. So, I mean, there's tons of stories. Another one, there's a one-armed convict, and I can't think of his name right now. I should have looked it up. But a African-American gentleman who's got basically one arm, but he's as strong as an ox, basically, is what he's saying. And the train accidentally runs over him as he's trying to work in between the engine and one of the cars. He gets run over. So Mr. Powell thinks he's dead. I think he was trying to grab, the guy was trying to hold on to the engine while trying to hold on to a bag of oranges that he got. And he only had one good arm, so he couldn't really do it. So he dropped him and he fell underneath. Anyway, Mr. Powell thought he'd been run over and he was dead. Because it boom, speed bump, and that was in it. And so he thought. So once they get the cars moved and the engine moved out of the way, the guy pops back up looking for his oranges. Like, where my oranges go? He pretty much had a sore back for a few days, and then he was good as gold. So lots of stories like that in that book. It's fascinating. Some of it just doesn't sound true, but apparently so. Very interesting stuff. All right, so that's one railroad coming through. Then again, that goes from Live Oak down to Rollins Bluff, which is now Branford. And we'll talk more about that and some others later. Meanwhile, you've got another railroad, and that is going to be called the Suwannee River Railway. Basically, it's established by Louis Buckey, who had been a business associate of Governor Drew. And the center of their operations was at Ellaville, which you can see up there towards the top center. Ellaville, which is now the Madison County side of the Suwannee River State Park. Columbus, the community that was on our side, moved over, basically everybody moved over to the Madison County side once Mr. Buckey built a huge sawmill and all the other, like a town pretty much, for workers. So they moved over to Ellaville, or it became Ellaville, and Louis Buckey bought out Mr. Drew's interests. He then established what was called the Suwannee River Railway because he needed a logging railroad to get further south to get to timber to bring back to his sawmills. So he builds it down originally to Hudson upon the Suwannee, which is right there. You now know it as Dowling Park, but it was originally Hudson upon the Suwannee. And he builds it down there because that's where there's a steamboat that connects at the time. So he wants to be able to transport his logs back and forth from Ellaville down to Hudson upon the Suwannee, Dowling Park today. And also start cutting out that timber in between. And so he starts working on that. Well, then it gets bought out in 1895 by Edward J. Carter, who lived in New York City. And he buys up the railroad plus the timber from the Buckey family. Buys up all those timber properties. And so he wants to extend that railroad even further south. He wants to go north to Jasper, and he wants to go south to Bronson, and then start accessing a bunch of the phosphate mines that are down, there's Bronson there, down in this area, have been found around Ocala, plus some down here around Louisville. So that's where Mr. Carter wants to expand this railway. So they buy it up, have capital of $1 million. Mr. Carter is president. There's a bunch of other folks that are not from here that are in charge of it. And it takes out this 1895 advertisement showing its anticipated route.
So we got a town named Flagler on this railroad?
Yeah, we have one named Flagler
Okay.
in Suwannee County, or community, not Suwannee County, but a community. Yes.
Cool.
I mean, we've had hundreds of communities in Suwannee County. I mean, there's Rivaldo, Bald Hill, I mean, Newland, all kinds of stuff we've had. We've had a Charleston even before here. So all those, I mean, that's all Suwannee County there. Lots of names. So that's the plan. That is the plan. They're going to be hauling timber from the sawmills in Ellaville. They're going to be hauling lime rock and phosphate, therefore, from mines around Louisville and Fredericksburg, which may be on there. Yeah, there it is. But it doesn't exist anymore. One of the many communities don't exist. And that's their plan. And they want to keep going. Well, like most of these railroads talk about, they don't ever get that far. It only goes on for a couple more years, and it doesn't get anywhere close to Bronson. This is closer to what it actually gets to. You can see it here, starting in Ellaville, coming down to Hudson upon the Suwannee, then going down to the Louisville area and just beyond. That's pretty much where it ends. That's as far as it goes. And let's see, here's another map of the Suwannee River Railway. That's probably a little bit more accurate than the other one just before. So it stops at Fredericksburg. That's as far as it gets, which is close to modern day McAlpin. And this is a map from the 1890s. And basically, it was shortly thereafter where this green, the one in green, was abandoned. Just one of those things. It could not compete. They could not get it to where it needed to be. But even though it was pretty much abandoned, it still shows up on maps for about 10 more years. So that one's kind of separate from all the ones we've been talking about. Not really connected except through the old Pensacola, Georgia, which is the blue one, which by this point is the FF and FCW, whatever, Florida Central Peninsula and all that stuff. All right, another railroad, Live Oak, Tampa, and Charlotte Harbor Railroad, incorporated in 1881 with Henry Plant and others. And so their point is to go from New Branford, which becomes Branford, which used to be Rollins Bluff. They want to go from Branford down to Tampa. So we've got the Live Oak to Lawton connector up to the north of Live Oak. That was built in the Civil War. We've got Live Oak to Rollins Bluff. That was built just as this one, basically, right before this one. And so he wants to go from Branford down to Tampa. So he starts working his way down to Tampa and Charlotte Harbor, that area. Well, as he's going south, he finds a group coming north, the Florida Southern Railway. So they're basically running into each other as they're building their tracks. And so Plant decides, hey, let me work it out where pretty much Plant's group gets this one gets everything north of Gainesville, and south of Gainesville, Florida Southern Railway gets. And so they're going to work it out. Plant's going to give them some money, the Florida Southern Railway, to build down to Charlotte Harbor. So that was the idea. So basically, this one was only going to go from Live Oak to Gainesville, and Gainesville to Charlotte Harbor, Tampa Bay area was going to go to the other one. Well, within 6 months, Plant just bought out the other one. So now he's got one big line going from Live Oak down to Charlotte Harbor. And it's incorporated into the Savannah, Florida, and Western. So this is an 1881 discussion of that surveyed property, and there's a lot more to it. So that's what he does. He just buys up different railroads and railways. So At this point in 1881, they'd only completed 6 miles of road eastward from Rollins Bluff. Because it went Rollins Bluff or Branford over a little bit and then down south. Pretty much following 129 and then 27 before it went down into Gilchrist County. What's now Gilchrist County. It wasn't then, but what's now Gilchrist County and beyond. So, all these things, all these railroads that Plant has bought, very quickly just comes to be called part of the Plant system. Because it's not just railroads at this point that Henry Plant has. He's got steamboats, he's got hotels, he's got transportation galore of all sorts. It's a one-stop shop. You want to go by train to a nice place, you can go by train, then take the steamboat over to his hotel. So he's got it all wrapped, kind of like Disney World, all wrapped up in one. You do all of it. And so he starts expanding as the Plant system. So you can see this railroad is part of the Savannah, Florida Western, so the SFW, which is the one that was through here, but it's all part of the Plant system. So it's got all these little subsidiary names for things. Well, he dies in 1899 at the age of 80, and he's buried in his birthplace of Branford, Connecticut. His railroad portion of the empire is then sold to the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, the ACL, and it is sold for, at the time, $46.5 million. That's almost $2 billion today. And it had over 2,200 miles of railroads. It was the largest railroad system in operation in the 19th century. So he had grown that from a bunch of bankrupt railroads to be the biggest one. So this is a picture of the Plant system circa 1900. You see all that in red is Plant. So he's got them all up into Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Florida, all the way through Florida down, and even you've got steamboats going down to Cuba. That's all part of his route, and there's hotels and stuff all there, especially places like Tampa. Tampa had a lot of his places, but others also. So he's got most of the railroads in Florida that Flagler doesn't have, pretty much, at that point. Flagler would have all the ones down the East Coast and down around Miami and stuff. That would be his. But all the red that you can see there is part of the Plant system. So it's massive, 2,200 miles worth of track. So it now becomes the Atlantic Coastline, the ACL. And that's what it stays for 67 years until it merges again with the Seaboard Airline. Well, meanwhile, you've got things going on. One of the newspaper articles I found, or references to newspaper articles, was from 1918. And the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, which the railroad, again, is part of that, would have been part of that Florida branch, that became part of the Atlantic Coastline. It became part of the Plant system, and then part of Atlantic Coastline. That railroad crossed the Suwannee River at basically the edge, the western edge of what's now Spirit of the Swan. I remember going over it all the time growing up because I lived down St. Church Road most of my life. And so that railroad was important going into Georgia and other places. And in 1918, World War I is going on. It's the final year of World War I, and it burns. That railroad bridge there at Suwannee River burns down. Lots of paranoia. And so even in the newspaper article from the Suwannee Democrat, if you were to read it, it talks about it could have been sabotage, German saboteurs type stuff. 100 feet of it was completely burned away, transportation stopped. It is known, is a known fact, the ACL is transporting and will transport many troops and military supplies, and there is suspicion that destruction is the work of an organization to stop communications or at least cause delay as much as possible. So, saboteurs. There's a German around every corner. Well, odds are it was probably just burned down. It happens. I never found anything else saying, these German saboteurs were captured, so nah. Probably just an accident or regular arson. It was rebuilt, and part of it still is there today. So that was the Atlantic Coastline. Part of it. Anyway, Then we get into another prominent family here in Suwannee County especially, and that's the Dowling family. Thomas Dowling specifically, but also his nephew Robert L. or R.L. Dowling are very instrumental in a number of railroads and industries here in Suwannee County. So that's Thomas Dowling on the left. That's Robert L. Dowling's house at what's now Dowling Park. They're on the right. So one of the railroads they helped establish is the Live Oak, Louisville, and Dead Man's Bay Railroad. They formed in 1893. Thomas Dowling is president. Thomas McIntosh is vice president. Thomas McIntosh is big in the phosphate industry down in Louisville. So he's vice president. Frank White is secretary, and Lewis, or R.L. Dowling, is the treasurer. So you've got two Dowlings there that are bigwigs in it. And its purpose is to build from Live Oak to Louisville and over to Dead Man's Bay and Lafayette through Lafayette-Taylor counties. It's about 60 miles. Well, their main goal is to get to all that phosphate that has recently been discovered down in Louisville. Ocala has it first, and then everybody's digging on their property to find stuff, and so they find a lot in Louisville. And so this railroad is Dowling's attempt to get to that phosphate, and then they want to take it over to Dead Man's Bay. Shipping it, lots of different ways. Well, they don't have enough money to build it or to complete it, so they only get about 9 miles done. And that gets to, basically to Louisville, not too much, and they can't even finish it. So it's just sitting there languishing. In 1895, the incomplete portion is bought up by the Live Oak and Gulf Company, but there's no charter. So that brings up another railroad, and one of several very similarly named railroads, the Live Oak and Gulf Railway. Because as we get through this lesson, you'll find the Live Oak and Gulf, the Live Oak and Perry, and then the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf. So they're all similarly named, not necessarily the same lines or the same parts of the lines. So the Live Oak and Gulf is chartered in 1895, and that's from men in New York and Ocala, and they take over the Live Oak, Louisville, and Dead Man's Bay Railroad. That's kind of the start of their railroad that they are completing. They also bring in T.I. McIntosh, Thomas McIntosh, who was on the board of the Live Oak, Louisville, and Dead Man's Bay Railroad. Bring him in to help expand and work on it. And this railroad basically makes its money from the phosphate mines in the Louisville area. So for a couple of years it goes on. But then they start realizing that the phosphate in Louisville is not good enough quality. It's got too much iron in it. When you're trying to make fertilizer or explosives, too much iron makes it even more explosive, makes it very unstable. And so they can't really use that phosphate for the purpose they want it to. And so this railway, no longer has a real point of surviving, and so it just kind of sits there. They're transporting some stuff, but they're just not making the kind of money that they want to make. So it gets sold and bought out a couple times, and then it merges with another one we're going to talk about in a minute called the Suwannee and San Pedro Railway in 1905. So this is a picture, the only picture I've ever seen of the Live Oak and Gulf Railway, and it's down at Louisville in 1896. So hold your thoughts on the Live Oak and Gulf because we'll come back to it. Oh, wow. Speed on. Drew family. Railroads again in Suwannee County. You've got to talk about the Drew family. George F. Drew on the left, who was that governor, and one of his sons, George L. Drew, on the right. Frank was another brother. He was more into the sawmill side of it, the lumber side, and George L. on the right was the train guy. George F. Drew was born in Alton, New Hampshire, 1827, moved to Georgia for the Civil War. He tried to stay out of the war. He eventually moved to Florida and moved over to Madison County, established probably at the time the largest sawmill in Florida, and a lot of other businesses there. He helps to work on something called the Suwannee and San Pedro Railroad, which is going to go across the Suwannee River. It's helped by people from Baltimore and Jacksonville. They're the ones that really incorporate it. but the Drew family quickly buys it out because they need it, because he's been building sawmills in Suwannee, Lafayette, and other counties, and he wants a railroad to access all of them. So he buys them up and connects it to the Live Oak and Gulf by a barge. And so that's their way of getting involved in the railroad industry and kind of stopping some of the others like the Live Oak and Gulf from further expanding. Well, after Governor Drew's death in 1900, the charter extends the route over to Dead Man's Bay. Not that it actually gets that far again, but that's the attempt to push it out. Well, it is a narrow gauge, 3 foot instead of 5 foot wide railroad, so it's a little different than the rest of them. But they have a lot of issues, but they do eventually merge with the Live Oak and Gulf to become the Florida Railway in 1905. So hold your thoughts, because we're going to go back to that one too. Another one created around this time in 1903 is the St. Mary's Suwannee and Gulf Railway. And that is organized by Governor Drew's sons, George and Frank Drew, along with some other folks. And their purpose is to go from Nassau County over on the East Coast through Charlton County, Georgia, then through Baker, Columbia, Hamilton, and Suwannee, and then go through Lafayette, Taylor, Jefferson, and McCulloch. So they're wanting to go that way. So all kinds of railroads crisscrossing or being proposed to crisscross through Suwannee County. The Drew family, specifically George L. Drew, is having an issue with the Seaboard Airline, which is one of those major railroads coming through this area. And they don't get along. And so the Drew family is going to be building this one as competition for the Seaboard Airline. Unfortunately for the Drew family, the Seaboard Airline gets wind of it, and so they buy up all the property along the route. And we're not selling it to you, sorry dude. So this railroad dies a very premature death. It really doesn't even get off the ground. It's stopped. It's dead before it even starts. So going back to the Florida Railway, they still have the Florida Railway. So they have merged these two railroads together, plus some branch lines. You can see them in pink, red, and then blue. Those 3 different groups merge to make the Florida Railway in 1905. And it struggles because of Frank Drew's stubbornness. That causes them trouble with not only the Seaboard Airline, but also the Atlantic Coastline, which are the 2 huge railroad systems going through this area. So he's trying to expand it to Jacksonville and other places. Well, he's getting stopped by these other big railroads. They keep saying, we don't like you. We don't want you to be in competition with us. We're going to buy up your property. We're going to stop people from working with you. And that's not helping. Plus, Thomas Dowling, locally, is a competitor with Mr. Drew in that family. And so Thomas Dowling buys up a lot of the sawmills that the Drew family has been using. Places like in Mayo and out in other places. Louisville area. He's buying them up. But the Florida Railway does have this interesting feature, the bridge. They have to build a bridge between the old Live Oak and Gulf over to the Suwannee and San Pedro ones that they had established earlier. So they need to link them with this railroad bridge. And so that's what they do. Now, it's installed in the early 1900s, but the markings on it indicate that it was built probably 30 or 40 years earlier. Some of the information on there, like the company name, Wadsworth, Buffalo, New York. It was established in 1860, and its name changed, became Wadsworth Iron Works in 1869, and then it changed again in 1871 or 1872. So the name of it indicates that it was built between 1869 and 1872. One of the stories I've heard is that this was supposed to go to Brazil and they moved it to here. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just one of the stories I've heard. But regardless, the age of the bridge seems to predate the age of the railroads. It's a very experimental design when they were still trying to figure out what's the best way to build an iron railroad bridge. So they built it. Again, the stampings indicate that it was within about a 4-year period, late 1860s, early 1870s. And so it's possible this is the oldest swing bridge in the United States, a railroad bridge anyway, and perhaps the oldest of any type. So we don't know, but it's still there today. That picture I took a few years ago on the bottom That was 1909 at the top, I think 2009 down on the bottom. So it's down around Louisville, downriver from Louisville, and I took it from a boat ramp. Good fishing down there, so I've been told. So that's the Florida Railway Bridge. Well, it continues to work, but it's having trouble because of all the competition. And it finally stops working in 1960. They shut it down. Basically, they're behind in payments. They have not even been able to pay their workers. So the employees start sabotaging the train and the tracks. They start tearing up the tracks, and it gets to the point where Mr. Drew and his wife can't even travel during the day because they're in danger of their lives. Now, the funny thing is, the Seaboard Airline, who they've been fighting for a decade and a half at this point, the Seaboard Airline could have bought it up. And it would have been a good investment for the Seaboard Airline to get into some of those spaces where they weren't, like Lafayette County and such, where they didn't have a presence. The Seaboard Airline hated the Drew family so much, they said, let them burn. Didn't buy it up. So they did nothing. They watched it crumble. So that's a picture of it. The smaller one is the Florida Railway, and then the Seaboard Airline on the other side. So then that company shuts down. The company tears up the lines, that kind of stuff. R.L. Dowling and Sons, again, that's the Dowling family. They have a sawmill in Live Oak, but then they have to keep extending further out to get more and more timber to cut. So they start heading towards Hudson upon Suwannee on the west part of the county. And eventually they get there. They've established this logging railroad, this logging company. And by 1900 it reaches Hudson upon the Suwannee, which is soon thereafter named or renamed Dowling Park because a sawmill is built there, and that brings in hundreds of workers. So basically Hudson upon the Suwannee becomes Dowling Park because of the Dowling family and their work there. And their railroad. So this short line, and they're starting to expand even into Lafayette County to get timber. It's basically a logging railroad. But then in 1903, there's a gentleman by the name of Skelton Williams, who's the president at the time of the Seaboard Airline. And he wants to use this railroad against the Drew family. And so he offers to buy them out or suggest that they incorporate and help work it out. So the Dowling family incorporates the R.L. Dowling and Sons Lumber Company Railroad into the Live Oak and Perry, LOP Railroad, Live Oak and Perry. So again, we've already had the Live Oak and Gulf. This is the Live Oak and Perry. So the Live Oak and Perry Railroad incorporates in 1903, but they can't get to Perry. They just don't have the money. Plus, Mr. Williams is no longer the president of the Seaboard Airline. And so they can't get as far as they want to. But this does show, as of 1904, how far it got. Stations at Live Oak, and then it goes westward towards Dowling Park, and it goes Live Oak, Star, Mercer, Platte, Lancaster, East Park, Dowling Park, Cheney, and then Mars Station, which was in Lafayette County. So that's as far as it did get. And then there's this nice description of Dowling's White Sulphur Park, which we now call just simply Dowling Park. So Live Oak and Perry is working, but it's not up to full capacity because they just don't have the money to expand it. Well, that's okay because Atlantic Coastline wants to get involved also. And so they get involved and they help finance a new railroad with a preferred agreement, and it becomes the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf Railroad. So the Live Oak and Perry now becomes the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf Railroad. So you've seen the Live Oak and Gulf, which is separate from the Live Oak and Perry, which becomes incorporated as part of the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf Railroad. So the LOP&G, 1905, is incorporated. The LOP&G, the Lope and Gopher, living on peas and grits. Again, it was originally built as a logging railroad, so it's not as, what's the right word I'm looking for? Not as comfortable riding as a purpose-built passenger railroad, which is why it's called the Lope and Gopher, because you're hitting all the gopher holes. It's a very bumpy ride. But they continue to expand, and they actually do get at least to Perry and a little beyond, a couple miles past it. And that operates for a few decades as such. It is then sold to the Atlantic Coastline, who's had that preferred agreement with it and helped finance it. Becomes part of the Atlantic Coastline, and then it is sold in 1928 to the Brooks Scanlon Corporation, which owned the huge sawmill over in Foley, Taylor County. Over the years, it transported a lot of logs, the timber, but also crops, watermelons, corn, hogs, tobacco, cotton, the football team for Suwannee County, and passengers. Some of the older folks remember riding it to go to games like in Perry. They would just take the railroad, the LOP&G, to the games. So, it's for many years. In 1954, the branch is sold to the Southern Railway, and then it's sold to the Georgia Southern Florida in 1971. Then it's sold to the Gulf in Ohio in 1994, and it even sold out, so it keeps getting sold. So pretty much our portion in Suwannee County and the surrounding areas is gone. It lives on in a name, sub-name somewhere under one of the successor lines, but it was for many years our predominant local railroad. And so that's kind of what it was as of 1955. So this was the Live Oak Prairie Gulf originally as the Live Oak and Gulf, from Live Oak just over to Chansey, which is over in Lafayette County, and then all this was added on afterwards. So that's part of the bigger, when it was part of the Florida Rail Net and all that stuff. But there's another railroad that comes in 1909, the Suwannee River and White Springs Railway. That one is going from Live Oak to White Springs to provide, again, timber access and also passenger service, because at this time you still got several hotels in White Springs. A lot of people want to travel there. And so this one is chartered by W.L. Tedder, C.H. Tedder, H.E. Barkus, W.W. Pennington, C.D. Blackwell, and H.H. Brown. Pretty much those families still live here today. And they want to carry passengers and freight from Live Oak to White Springs, 16 miles. But unfortunately, it doesn't get very far. By 1910, only 4.5 miles of track are laid down, and it's got a little bit of rolling stock, but it only lasts about 3 years. I don't think it ever actually gets all the way to White Springs. You can see it here from Live Oak up to White Springs. That is this railroad, Suwannee River and White Springs. So it doesn't get very far. So those are pretty much the main railroads through Suwannee County, non-logging railroads. In most cases. I can't talk about all the logging railroads because there's too many of them, but I do want to hit a couple before we end. One of them is the Bosch and Hagen company. They own sawmills, especially around Lurville, on both sides of the Suwannee River in Suwannee and Lafayette counties. And so what they would do is they would transport their engines by barge as needed from one side of the river to the other, depending on where it was needed the most. Well, one of the times they are transporting this old engine, which predates the Civil War, which had been probably used by the Pensacola in Georgia for many years until it was retired because of its age. And so they buy this up for the sawmill, for the logging railroad. You don't need the newest thing. You just need something that'll get you from point A to point B with your logs. And so they are transporting it by barge across the river, and it somehow slipped in the water and stayed there because it was old. It wasn't worth retrieving. And so it sat there for 70 plus years. And there was a man by the name of James Lancaster who lived at Lurville. As a boy, he remembered seeing this engine in the river when the river was at low, when it was low. And so as an adult, he was able to get the funding to go in and raise it in 1979 and park it basically outside his store in Lurville. Well, eventually it gets possessed, sold, bought to a different company who then donates it to the state. And it is parked in front of the Department of Agriculture from that point on. And even today is still there. Now this is prior to about 8 or 10 years ago when they built a pavilion around it to protect it and to showcase the history of it. But that railroad, that engine still is in Tallahassee today. And it is probably the oldest existing engine in the United States. Built probably 1855-ish, between 1850 and 1855, based on the type of wheels and a lot of stuff that those experts know that I don't know. So it's interesting. All right, so I talked about a lot of the communities being established because of the railroad and surviving because of it. So for the next few minutes, going over an hour now, but in the next few minutes, we're going to talk about some of those depots and whatnot related to it. Downtown Live Oak, for instance. Live Oak was founded on Pensacola, Georgia, in or prior to 1861. I've already mentioned that. Downtown Live Oak originally was on Houston Street and Connor Street, there at the railroad. That was the original downtown Live Oak. And there was a railroad depot there, a small depot that was built there. I don't have any photograph of it, I wish I did. Just a description of it, more or less. Well, after the Civil War ended, we have a lot of folks coming down to Florida and to Live Oak, one of them being John Parsley and his wife Nancy Parsley. They buy up property on the east side of what was then downtown Live Oak, and they start laying down streets like Ohio Avenue, Howard Street, Wilbur Street, Parsley Street. Those are all named for the Parsley family, and Ohio is where they had moved from. And so their house is there, and they want to put the courthouse across the street. And that's a whole other story in and of itself. But eventually the courthouse location is established where it is today. They put a courthouse down, and that becomes downtown Live Oak. And so most of the businesses moved from the old downtown area to the newer, current, where we have today downtown. And the railroad depot follows. And so they move one, and this becomes what they build over at the new downtown area. This was located south of the current museum, south of the current freight depot, what is now the museum, and in between the railroad tracks. So not a lot of covering. And I forgot to read a poem. I had a poem. But it basically was a guy written by John Willis Maynard, who was a poet, newspaper publisher, and politician. He was also the first African American elected to the House of Representatives. So in 1879, he has to come to Live Oak for business, or go through Live Oak. And so he's got to stay there at that platform, that railroad depot. And so he writes a poem called Waiting at Live Oak. He basically has to wait like 7 or 9 hours. And I didn't bring it, but we're running behind. So but if you find, just Google it and look for it. But basically, he is not happy with having to stay pretty much in the rain and bad weather in Live Oak, where he can't even get under something to stand under. So you see people here, it's just a platform with a couple buildings. So he complains about Live Oak. Well, that spurs on some construction.
That's
some
Water
work.
Street in the lower right then?
Let's see how I describe it here.
It's on that side of the track?
Let's see. The view is toward the east, and Connor Street is the bottom right.
Yeah,
Yeah. So the railroad tracks are over on the other side. So yeah, this will be Connor Street, aka Railroad Street, sometimes depending on which year. But yeah, this will be Connor. So I'll show you. That was the first one at that location, but then they built a better one, a little bit better one, and this gives you a better idea of where it would locate. So these are passenger and the freight depots, the old ones, prior to 1903. This is looking from the water tower, Dowling's water tower that's still there today, looking southwest. So this is Connor Street, the railroad tracks are here, Ohio Avenue is there on the top right, and some of those buildings still exist. Loving is here, for instance. That's Loving building there. So this is Ohio Avenue. But this is what is then built, a little bit better, a little bit more covered, and some of the freight depots and that kind of stuff. They then built a new Atlantic Coastline freight depot in 1903 on the right-hand side of that picture, just out of the picture, which is now where the museum is located, the new Atlantic Coastline freight depot. They also would build a new passenger depot, which I'll talk about these in just a minute. But that was downtown Live Oak as of circa 1900, let's put it that way. But they need something better than what's here. So in 1903, the Atlantic Coastline builds a new freight depot just to the west of where the other ones were. So that's an early 1900s picture of it, used for 60 some years before it finally closes. 1990s, it's renovated, it becomes the Suwannee County Historical Museum, which continues to be even today. That's a picture of it in the 60s while it's still in use. And that's a more recent picture of it, even today. So, still there. Well, by the early 1900s, you've got more passenger service. You've got several railroads coming through Live Oak. Not only the Atlantic Coast Line, the Seaboard Airline, but you've got the Live Oak, Perry and Gulf. You've got the Florida Railway. All of those have not just cargo service, but passenger service. And so the small depot they've been using, which is pretty much one of those, is not good enough. And so they need to build something new. And so eventually, after lots of decisions, in 1909, they built a Union passenger depot right here. Here's the freight depot, the museum today. But they build the passenger depot between the ACL freight depot and the main railroad tracks. At one point, we've got about a dozen tracks here for all these different railroads. So you can see some of them here. So the ACL, the SAL, the LOP&G, Florida Railway, they all come through this part of Live Oak in this area. So they build this Union Depot. And this kind of shows you a different view. So the ACL Freight Depot is the museum today, it's still there. The passenger depot, the new passenger depot, gets moved over to this side. This one even shows the old one. That shows, well, part of the new one and the old one. Let's see, what year was this done? Yeah, that shows the old depots that were, again, mainly wood and not totally covered. So they replace them and put the new one here that's made out of brick. But after it's all said and done, they then sell it and move it. We get to move it in the 1990s or 80s. Operates for many years in that location. But then they shut down passenger service of all those railroads by the 1960s or so, 1971. Last passenger service ends. And so it sits there for a decade or two, and the railroad wants to tear it down or sell it because they want to reuse that property. And so a group called Pride in Action is formed in Suwannee County, and they raise funds to buy the property, buy the building, and to move it. And so they cut the building in two and move it to the north side of the freight depot, the old freight depot, which becomes the museum. And if you go there today, you can still see the line where they cut it in two to move it. If you go to the museum, they've got a lot of pictures of the actual move. It's pretty cool to watch. And it sat there for many years until money was found to restore it. I helped write some of the grants on it. And so today, of course, it's used by North Florida College as a satellite campus. So it's been through a lot of the years. And I've got lots of pictures of it pre and post repair, but 15-year-old building now, still going strong. And the Atlantic Coast Line, 120 years as of last year, still going strong too. We also had the Seaboard Airline Freight Depot, which was across Ohio Avenue in what was called the Y. And the Y is where you got some of the railroads going up north and east and west. Right here is pretty much Connor Street. And so it was located, I think number 2, right there, freight warehouse, all that kind of stuff. There were several warehouses there. Worth Stevens, J.W. Bloom, C.W. Rogers, all that kind of stuff. Lots of businesses there downtown. I don't know when the Seaboard Airline Freight Depot was built. The earliest description or drawing of it that I have is 1903. It was already there. Between 1903 and 1906, it actually was extended. They added on to it to make it even longer with a covered platform, basically, probably for cotton and stuff like that. So they built that. Take that back. I had an 1895 picture of it too. Seems to be the same thing. So we don't know how old it was. I don't have in my records anyway how old it was. But it's older than the Atlantic Coast Line depot. Well, it survives for a while. It gets moved when Huffman and Gilmore is built in the 40s. This is where it was. Huffman and Gilmore, they have it moved to where it is, or where it was in this picture. And so that's the old Seaboard Airline depot. And so it's there. And in 1972, it receives a lot of wind damage. We have a bad storm, and it receives a lot of wind damage. Tears off part of the roof. And so they decide it's not worth salvaging. So they basically sell it, auction off and sell it. And a guy buys it to tear down. He reuses the timbers to build himself a house and a couple of other houses. And some of these timbers are huge. And tears it down. And you can see the Atlantic Coastline depot there in the back or on the top right. And so it's torn down and it's gone. No more. You also have other depots around the community, some of which don't exist, like the Welborn one, no longer there. This picture was taken in the 60s. You've got the Branford Depot, which was an old one also, that was used for many decades until they shut down, and it was moved to its present site in 1982, closer to the river, and is now used by the Branford Shrine Club. And that was Branford's old depot. And then you had what's probably, oh, there it is today, Branford Depot today. So that was mid-50s, and that's the current picture of it, after it got moved. You've also got what is probably the Dowling Park Depot, early 1900s, that no longer exists either. But by the early 1900s, you've got things like automobiles, which there's a picture of one right there, that are being built in greater numbers, and it just gets to the point where it's no longer feasible economically to have all those railroads continuing. So one by one, they're abandoned, they merge, they shut them down, they tear them up, until eventually the only one that's left is the line that used to be our first one. Same route as the first one. The old Pensacola in Georgia, which is now the Florida Gulf and Atlantic FGA. So basically it runs on the same route that the original railroad through Suwannee County does. So it's kind of interesting. The first one is also the last one. Very interesting. So again, this is not an exhaustive listing. These are the major ones, either regionally or locally, that were not mainly logging railroads. And here's that list I was telling you. So there's lineage of the East and West Running Railroad. Pensacola in Georgia, then the JP&M, the FCNW, then the FRNC, then the FCNP, then the Seaboard Airline, the Seaboard Coastline, then the Seaboard System, CSX, Florida Gulf and Atlantic. That's where it is today, part of Rail USA. Then you've got the major north-south running railroads, and that was 3 different ones that eventually merged together to become the Savannah, Florida and Western, and then the Atlantic Coastline for many years, and eventually in the 1980s it was abandoned. And then they tore up the tracks, and it's now part of the Greenway Trail. And they're hoping to expand it all the way through Suwannee County. Right now it's around O'Brien, maybe up to McAlpin area. So, a few minutes late. Any questions? Nobody left, thank y'all, sorry. I gave the 45-minute version of it Saturday. I just wanted to give y'all a little bit more this time, because some of y'all came back. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Let's see, next month we are talking about, what are we talking about? Military history. Military history next month. There we go. Which I will update it. It's been 5 years since I've updated it, but yep, military history next month. I love military history. So I'll try to keep it within 5 hours. Thank y'all again. Lord willing, see y'all next month.